Midwest. I think there's going to be some very interesting and stimulating papers. My name is Paul Murphy, I'm from Grand Valley State, and I will chair the session, and I did prepare a few comments. And we will go in the order of the program. So I'll introduce each speaker and then I'll invite you up to give your presentation. So our first speaker is Michael Allen. He's a professor of history and American studies at the University of Washington, Tacoma. He's a specialist in Western history, led the Mississippi Valley, we were just speaking, and the frontier, and has written on Ohio and Mississippi Valley, rivermen and rodeo cowboys in the American imagination. And he is also co-author of the best-selling The Patriot's History of the United States. So he's speaking today on rural realists and other romantics, agrarianism, from Hamlin Garland to John Donnellan.
Thank you very much. And good afternoon. Thanks for coming. I'm going to read you a little portion of a book manuscript I have that has a working title of Mississippi River Valley, The Course of American Civilization. And this paper is too long, so as I run out of time, I'm going to summarize a few things, kind of go extempore and summarize. Because I've got a YouTube of John Mellencamp that I want to play before we get out of here today. So that's kind of my ambition, is to make it to the YouTube in 20 minutes. And I read a couple of papers at this conference. The first one I started out with, this was in Omaha, I started out with Frederick Jackson Turner and ended with Bob Dylan. So today I'm going to start out with Hamlin Garland and end with John Mellencamp and talk about rural realists and other romantics. Henry Nash Smith waits until the closing sections of Virgin Land, the American West, and Myth and Legend to discuss the late 19th century rural realist writers Edgar Watson Howe and Hamlin Garland. Their depictions of the upper Mississippi Valley and story of a country town and main traveled roads do not seem to belong alongside Smith's discussion of mythic portraits of the American West as the Garden of Eden. Their heroes are not equal to James Fenimore Cooper's Hawkeye and the dime novels Dead-Eye Dick and Kit Carson. Hamlin Garland, native Midwesterners, painted scenes of back-breaking labor, harsh weather, economic exploitation, broken personal relationships, and bitter disappointment for those who migrated west in a vain search for the Garden of Eden. In writing unromantic fictional accounts of their Mississippi Valley world, the two helped to found a school of rural realism characterized by early literary critics as the revolt of the village. This paper will explore the contradictory strains of disapproval and affection, cynicism and romanticism for Midwestern farm and small town life woven throughout the novels and poems of the rural realists. I'll begin with Garland and then briefly discuss Edgar Lee Masters, Willa Cather, Sherwood Anderson, and Sinclair Lewis, and end in the modern period with Indiana folk rocker John Mellencamp, a contemporary agrarian and rural realist. I propose no new theory here, and I'm certainly not going to try to emulate this book, which I saw in a very early form by John Locke, but I think he and I have some overlap and some matching interests. And I'm just going to give you today my reading of these writers' complex feelings towards the upper Mississippi Valley world they depicted in their art. The prevailing interpretation of the rural realists is that they were highly critical of the culture of the Midwestern farms and towns, portraying the folk as exploited, impoverished, isolated, backward, narrow-minded, and anti-intellectual. In Main Street, Sinclair Lewis's character Guy Pollock diagnoses intellectual malaise as the village virus, which infects ambitious people who stay too long in the provinces and is enforced by an oligarchy of respectability. Like their populist and progressive contemporaries, rural realists called for political as well as spiritual reform to improve the bleak lives of Mississippi Valley family farmers and small town residents. The preceding generalizations, however, do not always withstand scrutiny. Close examination shows recurrent doses of Henry Nash Smith's mythic and romantic West and rural realism. For Garland, Cather, Lewis, Anderson, and others felt loyalty and love as well as antipathy for their native ground. The parallel with populism is important here. While the political populists bitterly condemned the plight of the American farmers, they simultaneously held a love of the land and idealistic hope that with reform they might yet attain an agricultural Eden. Populists were just as nostalgic for the paradise lost as they were determined to shake up America's political and economic structure. Thus, populism was at once conservative and radical. Of course, I'm borrowing from Hofstadter here. And one can see the same ambivalence among the rural realists, populism's cultural wing. The rural realists reflects a deep love of the Midwestern landscape, the changing seasons, and even the small towns and townspeople who they simultaneously chastise. Within their cynicism and criticism, one detects a sense of yearning for a rural world lost, an imagined agricultural utopia that has somehow eluded their grasp. It is this frustrated vision that makes the rural realists at once cynics and idealists. Hamlin Garland, and this is our second time today we've gotten to see Hamlin Garland, after whom our society names one of its most prestigious awards. He came of age in the postbellum Upper Mississippi Valley during the waning days of the family farm. The Garland family failed at homesteading in Wisconsin, Minnesota, Iowa, and South Dakota, enduring blizzards, insect infestations, drought, and economic hardship. Although Garland initially left the upper Midwest, he soon returned and I'm quoting, in spite of the dust and the heat wrecks, dreamt of poems and stories. The result was Maine Travel Grove's Stories of the Mississippi Valley, an 1891 collection telling of failed farms, heartless bankers, and romantic love forsaken for practical, economically motivated marriages. Garland's realism, however, was at odds with his strong sense of place. He had a good ear for and fondness of upper Mississippi Valley dialect, folkways, and landscape. The opening descriptive scenes in A Branch Road and Up the Coulee, when prodigal sons return to their home, show sensitivity and strong affection for the Midwest. Like many populists, Garland combined a love of his native region with hatred for the human misery he blamed on businessmen and politicians. Garland idealistically believed that populist reform, combined with the inherent strength of the common folk and rich countryside, would produce an agrarian land of milk and honey. You see how I'm heading to John Mellencamp here in Farm Aid? You know, it's just like, it's this long mythic path. The greatest rural realist poet was Edgar Lee Masters, whose innovative Spoon River anthology won acclaim and a sizable readership upon its 1915 publication. Born in Garnett, Kansas, and raised in rural Illinois, Masters gravitated to populism and agrarian reform. The Spoon River anthology consists of 244 fictional free verse poems, each spoken from the viewpoint of a resident of the small Illinois town of Spoon River. The book's most striking feature is its voice, for each of the book's speakers is dead. Their voices emanate from the community's graveyard, where all are sleeping on a hill. Some critics have portrayed Edgar Lee Masters as a cold cynic who sits in condemnation of the rural Midwest. Yet, as John Poyce and others have observed, Masters does not condemn these men and women in his poems. He empathizes with them. And I'm quoting Poyce here, with the exception of some half-dozen cold-blooded exploiters of the people, not a ghost among these race, but is understood, condoned, allowed for, and forgiven. In the rank arena of all this squalor, the poet preserves his grand, equal, and unmitigated equilibrium. This is why in later books, Masters wrote of the hospitable, warm-hearted, and generous people of Illinois. This is in his book, The Sangamon, which is in the Rivers of America series, and spoke of the magical appeal to me quite beyond my power to describe. I loved the people there then, and I love their memory. Willa Cather's life changed remarkably at age 10 when her family migrated from Virginia to farm near Red Cloud, Nebraska, where the fertile tallgrass prairie becomes the shortgrass prairie of the Great Plains. After graduating from the University of Nebraska and becoming a successful New York journalist and progressive reformer, Cather's rediscovery of the Nebraska prairies set her imagination afire. She began to write about her native Midwest, a task that, she later reflected, was like taking a ride through familiar country on a horse that knew the way. Her Nebraska trilogy, O Pioneers, Song of the Lark, and My Antonia, added a strong woman's voice to and further refined the rural realist ambivalent portrayals of the passing of the agricultural frontier. Nostalgic yearning combines with grim realism in My Antonia, a story reflecting many rural realist themes: homesickness, hard work, small-town pettiness, and in Antonia's case, seduction, betrayal, and her father's suicide. Yet this is balanced by nostalgic, yearning passages describing the intimacies of family and friends amid the seasonal cycles of the Nebraska prairie. The novel's opening passage evocatively describes the Midwestern landscape that Antonia and Catherine loved. While the train flashed through the never-ending miles of ripe wheat by country towns and brightly flowered pastures in oak groves wilting in the sun, we, the author and Jim Burton, sat in the observation car. We were talking about what it was like to spend one's childhood in little towns like these, buried in wheat and corn, under stimulating extremes of climate, burning summers when the world lies green and billowy beneath a brilliant sky, when one is fairly stifled in vegetation, in the color and smell of strong weeds and heavy harvests, blustery winters with little snow, when the whole country is stripped bare and gray as sheet iron. We agreed that no one who had not grown up in a little prairie town could know anything about it. It was a kind of Freemasonry. Garland, Masters, and Cather led the way for post-World War I writers like Sherwood Anderson and Sinclair Lewis, whose novels Winesburg and Main Street marked a crescendo of rural realist fiction. And I'm not going to read this section of the paper, but I'll just add an aside about Main Street and the battle of wills between Will Kennicott and Carrie. Arguably Will Kennicott is the hero of Main Street, and I'm reminded when I think of the novel of when he takes her pheasant hunting, and they drive in the country in a carriage, and she gets to see the landscape really for the first time. And then they visit a farm family, and a wholesome Scandinavian farm family, and he shows her a little bit about his medical practice and what he does. And those are very evocative scenes. But they're also countered by the village virus and all the pettiness and gossip and backbiting of the town of Gopher Prairie. And so he really, he has mixed emotions, I think, about Gopher Prairie. Well, rural realism continued into the 20s and 30s, but the rural realists had said just about everything they had to say. It was a great deal. They had exposed the illusion of rural innocence and small-town virtue, pointed to the plight of Midwestern farm women and economic and social injustice, and called for populist and progressive reforms. They had critiqued the dream of an agrarian utopia. Yet, and there's always a yet when talking about rural realism, these literary artists were Jeffersonian hearts, and I'm quoting, plagued by a strangely cold and despotic America. Like their populist political allies, they were simultaneously drawn to historic and modern America. Richard Hofstadter has written, "The utopia of the populace was in the past, not the future. The populace looked backward with longing to the lost agrarian Eden. They would have liked to restore the conditions prevailing before the development of industrialism and the commercialism of agriculture." The populist literary counterparts, the rural realists, were not true realists. Their vision was too agrarian, and this Jeffersonian agrarianism makes their literature poignant. They were writers in search of a lost world. In 1985, following a Midwestern drought and agricultural recession, a group of country rock musicians started a fundraising concert series called Farm Aid. Willie Nelson, John Mellencamp, Neil Young, and several others allied to save the family farm from extinction. Mellencamp is an Ohio Valley folk rocker who has written and sung a large body of work about small towns and farms of his southern Indiana youth. Like Nelson and Young, Mellencamp is a modern progressive, still captivated by images of rural lifestyle and the myth of the Midwest. I always think of these guys when I go to Whole Foods and stand in the middle aisle, you know, look around, or a farmer's market. And I think of contemporary liberals who want to be farmers. And but again, there's it's a mixed message. In Rain on the Scarecrow, he sings, the crops we grew last summer weren't enough to pay the loans, couldn't buy the seed to plant I just see that I lost my slideshow here, right as I was moving up to my crescendo, of course. Couldn't buy the seed to plant this spring, and the farmer's bank foreclosed. Yet this dark lament is more than balanced by Mellencamp's paean to rural life, his smash hit Small Town. No, I cannot forget where it is that I come from. I cannot forget the people who love me. Yeah, I can be myself in this small town, and the people let me be just what I want to be. Well, I was born in a small town, and I can breathe in a small town. I'm gonna die in this small town, and that's probably where they'll bury me. Well, let me see if I can find this thing again.
It's just moving the cursor.
Oh, good, cool. So, now, I'm going to bring this up and notice the backdrop. This is 2016, and it's the stage of the annual Farm Aid concert where they're going to save the family farm. And notice the We're going to save the family farm with heavily amplified electronic gear. That's absolutely essential. Thanks very much.
Our next speaker is Tico DeBoer. Tico teaches American history at St. Mary's University of Minnesota. He has published on the environment and the American South and is author of Nature, Business, and Community in North Carolina's Green Swamp, published in 2008. His current project under contract at the University of Nebraska Press is Plumed Meteors Trained to Kill, a history of American falconry.
Thank you. Yes, so this particular paper comes out of a larger work on the history of falconry. I have a few images that I might just pull up here and there. On a major slideshow, I can pull up the Nazis. These Nazis are always will allow me anyway. There we go. Hamlin Garland, I don't know if you know this, was an avid falconer. And the German Luftwaffe was partly inspired by his love of falcons and the way they flew. Anyway, we're not going to do Nazi history today, but I always thought it was pretty fascinating. Here's an American falconer, but in India. Anyway, I'm going to talk today about Dan O'Brien, an author who came from the Midwest and is now considered kind of a Western author, but his work is kind of located sort of where West meets Midwest. And I came to him because of this study of falconry, and really the way that falconry among falconers at least shaped an environmentalist and conservationist agenda. So, Dan O'Brien was born in Ohio in 1947. He attended college there and in Michigan, where he played college football, most important later on, and later earned an MA in English Literature from the University of South Dakota and an MFA from Bowling Green State University in Ohio. So very Midwestern, all of that. He also worked as a biologist for the state of South Dakota. Yet his work as a biologist later took him from the Midwest to the Mountain West, where the Peregrine Fund, a conservation initiative based at Cornell University, sought to, quote, reestablish the endangered peregrine falcon to the cliffs along the Rocky Mountain front. In fact, this man over here, Karl Heinz at Cornell's a very important person in trying to breed falcons in captivity in Ithaca, New York, which was mildly successful. It was here that O'Brien obtained his first falcon, Dolly, whom he and his crew could not release into the wild because she had gotten too old while they were waiting for a good opportunity, while eagles were swooping down, killing all the hacks that they were putting out. Yet whom he wanted to be able to become as wild as possible in her new circumstances. He took the peregrine falcon from her home among the mountains and plains of the Intermountain West to his own ranch in western South Dakota, part of, quote, the entire ecosystem that the birds depended upon, and became a falconer. It is no coincidence that O'Brien has done and located his work, both his physical engagement with his surrounding environment and his writing about it, in the area where the West meets the Midwest. He calls it in another piece the rolling, untold miles of grass that we call the Great Plains. Here's how he describes them in his 1991 novel, In the Center of the Nation, wedged between mountains and fertile black soils. Coming from either direction, the land changes before you, so before you have a chance to get ready for it. Traveling eastward, you see the grasslands for the first time from several thousand feet up in the Rocky Mountains. You come around a turn intent on the ruggedness of the mountains, and suddenly the pine trees, rocks, and fast-running water are gone. Below you, though still 50 miles off, is the flattest, smoothest, most treeless stretch of land imaginable. And if you're traveling west, you've just gotten used to the fertile black soils of Indiana, Illinois, and Iowa, just come to expect the neatly painted, prosperous farm buildings surrounded by cultivated groves of trees, when you come to the Missouri River and it all goes to hell. Suddenly, the order is gone, the prosperity scattered. When you get the feeling that the whole world can see you, but no one is watching, you have come to the grasslands of North America. So that's a long passage from In the Center of the Nation. This is an environment that O'Brien depicts consistently in his fiction as well as in his more memoir-like books as, quote, a difficult land. In fact, he explicitly calls it that in his most recent book, Wild Idea, Buffalo and Family in a Difficult Land, which, like Buffalo for the Broken Heart, Restoring Life to a Black Hills Ranch, 2001, describes his efforts to restore the grasslands ecosystem of his South Dakota ranch by reintroducing not only the area's native grasses, but also its keystone species, the buffalo. The landscape O'Brien evokes in his writing is rarely idyllic, Edenic, pastoral, or bucolic, but more typically violent, disruptive, unpredictable, but at the same time cyclical, and as such often an obstacle to successful farming and ranching. Cleve Miller, character in the Center of the Nation, who forewent the career in medicine his father envisioned for him because of the arrogance of doctors and their, quote, disgraceful salaries, and who instead took up ranching when he inherited his parents' land, declares, cattle isn't really a business, it's a joke. The real business in this part of the country is tourism. Yet whereas O'Brien's writing betrays little sympathy for tourist attractions, such as a large metal sign that reads, Center of the Nation, near the fictional town of Hardy, South Dakota, and the spendthrift tourists they are supposed to attract, it is clearly enamored of people tenaciously clinging to the modest living they eke out of the land, drawn to its often overwhelming beauty, they take its many vicissitudes and harsh disappointments in stride. South Dakota was a beautiful place, with values that were straightforward and honest. She was a woman who left her rancher husband to pursue a career in dance in Los Angeles, that other West, antithetical to O'Brien's, whose inhabitants think South Dakota, quote, is a sort of summer camp where those who need a shot of nature go to play cowboy. Indeed, this notion runs throughout O'Brien's work. The Grasslands is defined not only by its ecology, but also by a set of social values that make it as much a heartland as, say, John Mellencamp's Indiana. I threw it in there after I knew Mike was going to talk about John Mellencamp. Anyway, these values are simplicity, modesty, honesty, tradition, loyalty to family and friends, hard work, tenacity, being informed and cultured, reading serious literature and listening to NPR appear both in his fiction and his memoirs, but not pretentious and elitist, stoically enduring hardships and tacitly accepting limitations. And it is nature and humans' relationship with it that ultimately shapes these values. Dealing with the unpredictability and wildness of weather, soil, plants, and animals reminds the people of the grasslands of the vastness of nature and their own smallness within it. They are, one might say, down to earth, in a more literal sense of the phrase, and define success as, quote, the ability to move from one disappointment to the next without losing your enthusiasm. So, in this regard, now we'll get to the more environmental part here, O'Brien's work evokes the life and legacy of Aldo Leopold, in particular the land ethic he outlined in a Sand County Almanac, published in 1949, shortly after his death of a heart attack while battling a wildfire on a neighbor's property. Famously, Leopold, born and raised in Iowa, with annual family vacations here in Michigan to boot, came to learn to think like a mountain, is his famous phrase, while working for the U.S. Forest Service in New Mexico, so another trip out west, where he came to regret his participation in the federally sanctioned killing of wolves, the key species in the arid mountain environment of the Southwest. This realization of the interconnectedness of and interdependency among species within larger ecosystems underpinned his subsequent efforts to restore, in another word from O'Brien, 8 acres of sand country land near Madison, Wisconsin, where he taught at the university, and spending much time with his family at the shack he erected there. The idea here was not to restore nature to some sort of pristine state by removing the destructive human presence, but to have humans live on and with the land differently. That is, with a set of values different from what Leopold called the Abrahamic approach to land, considering land one's outright property, different thereby from the materialism, consumerism, and accumulation of wealth and goods that he saw as the great threat to both the natural world and people's potentially harmonious relationship with it. Again, I spoke by the way I have these images up. So here's an image of, a famous image of Aldo Leopold in actually in Mexico, pondering nature upon a mountain. It reminded me of O'Brien's writing, sitting in the mountains, watching eagles kill all those falcons that they were trying to reintroduce, and getting all the more frustrated. And it turns out that this kind of literature is actually full of these kinds of awakening moments. So Leopold's sort of the model for awakening to matters of conservation. So when O'Brien therefore writes a wild idea that he needs to expand his buffalo ranch in order to, quote, equal the scope of the landscape, he really does so in Leopoldian terms. Now, of peculiar interest here, to me anyway, but I hope you're following along, is that Aldo Leopold was also an advocate of falconry, even if he himself, unlike his son Karl, did not take up the sport. According to his biographer Kurt Meine, Leopold, while in Europe in 1935, experienced, quote, without qualification, an exciting display of falconry by the Baron and Baroness von Wietinghoff-Reich of Saxony. He also joined some other German nobles in a partridge hunt and for a field trial. This exposure to hunting in Europe, with all its ceremony and ritual, made quite an impression on Leopold, who took extensive notes on the falconry display he witnessed for his son Karl. Yet Leopold felt something was missing, writes Meine. Quote, the successful participant in such a hunt, he wrote, this is he being Leopold, needs endurance and especially marksmanship, but no woodcraft. Indeed, he has no opportunity for the exercise of hunting skill, even if he possesses it. He has no part in working the dogs, and no choice in the selection of ground. By the end, this is Meine again, by the end of this trip, Leopold had come to realize what was lacking in Germany, wildness. When Leopold wrote his classic, The Sand County Almanac, though, he did include a ringing endorsement of falconry as the most glamorous hobby I know of today. Even though Leopold's main point in this case was that a good hobby, defined by its lack of urban industrial utility, effectiveness, and efficiency, constituted a, quote, solitary revolt against the commonplace, or a collective, quote, rebellion. His endorsement of the sport within the larger ecological content of the Sand County Almanac strengthened falconers' claim that falconry was an act of conservation. So, in his rating against the urban industrial machine that was destroying nature, inefficient hobbies were the best kind, said Leopold. So the subject of my paper, Dan O'Brien, also came upon falconry and learned from it this notion, right, that wildness is good, that species are interconnected, and that nature is cruel. I want to give you a very brief history of falconry. Again, this is my longer project. But falconry has been around for centuries, if not millennia. The origins of falconry are disputed, and most falconers who write about the sport resort to phrases like, the origins are hidden in the mists of time, and it's always an ancient sport of kings. So we don't really know. But they often point to this particular bas-relief from Khorshabad from 1700 BC as evidence that even back then people were practicing falconry. Anyway, falconry became a sport very popular in India, in the Middle East, in North Africa, in China, in Japan, in medieval Europe, but it never, at the time of the great expansion of the world to the Americas, became an American sport. There's some evidence that some people tried falconry in colonial America, but it never took hold of the practice for a variety of reasons, one of which being that it's really too wooded to hunt with hawks and falcons, which is much better done in open fields. What evidence I have found is that in the 19th century, especially the late 19th century, knowledge of falconry began to spread in the United States. And many journals and magazines and newspapers published articles about it, even though I have found no evidence of anyone actually doing it, which is not to say that no one did it, but again, there is no evidence to suggest that people were actively engaging in falconry. Some people tried, but what was especially important was that in 1920, so we're jumping from 17 BC to 1920, history in birdsflight. In 1920, the ornithologist Luis Agassiz Fuertes, who was actually at Cornell University, published in National Geographic an article called Falconry, the Sport of Kings. So he was making a number of paintings for National Geographic just of birds of prey, and as he was doing research, he came across references to falconry. He studied it somewhat, and then wrote this article about the sport of kings. Now, in those days, at least my sources suggest, young people read magazines in paper form, and young boys especially came to be turned on by falconry because of this article in National Geographic. Among them, people like John and Fred Craighead, two boys from lived in Pennsylvania, also in D.C., who themselves have an awakening story to the crime that was the killing of birds of prey, which was actually common at the time. There were vermin, and people basically shot anything that looked like a hawk or a falcon. Some of them had really bad names. So the peregrine falcon, for example, was known as the duck hawk in those days because it killed the ducks. The duck hunters wanted to kill. So anyway, more awakening, and a bunch of these guys began to practice falconry, much to the dismay of people who thought that this was animal cruelty. And so as falconers became organized and began to create organizations as well as journals to promote falconry and also promote the right way to do it, they began to adopt a conservationist ethos, proclaiming that falconers were conservationists. But initially, this is important to the story here, the early falconers, among whom is this man over here, R. Luff Meredith. We have lost some great names in the course of American history. R. Luff Meredith, the father of American falconry, were more concerned with falconry as pet keeping. And they spoke about their falcons as if they were pets with whom they had warm relationships. Their pets knew them. Their falcons knew them. And more important than wild birds hunting as close to nature as possible, they had the idea that you could actually tame and domesticate hawks and falcons. A good example of this was the attempt, for example, during World War II, to train falcons at Fort Monmouth in New Jersey to attack enemy pigeons. Now you wonder, how would the falcon know if a pigeon was German or English? The idea was that the Germans actually used pigeons during the day, and the Allies only at night, and falcons hunted during the day. So any pigeon at the time would have been a German pigeon. They also were trained supposedly to attack enemy parachutists. That also didn't go very well. In the course of the history of falconry, this is where Dan O'Brien comes on board, falconers began to move away from the notion that falcons and hawks were pets. But the idea of falconry was to keep them as close to wild as possible, to basically accommodate their wildness as their owner. And so O'Brien is very much concerned, therefore, with the wildness of falcons and the wildness of nature as it shapes the relationship between human beings and nature, and that wildness includes unpredictability as well as outright death. And that these things should not be romanticized, he says, but this is the reality of people living in a place like western South Dakota. So Dan O'Brien's The Rites of Autumn, the Falconer's Journey Across the American West, is a wonderful description not only of a physical journey across the West with falcons in tow and on fist, but also of an intellectual journey toward O'Brien's ethic, toward a difficult land where he lives and works. The book is full of encounters, hunts, observations, and musings that illustrate the ideas I have outlined above, and allow me to highlight a few passages that indicate the importance of those values, as well as the ways in which falconry has helped foster in O'Brien an acceptance, perhaps even an appreciation, of wildness, death, disappointment, unpredictability, and hardship in his understanding of the relationship between humans and their environment. So, there's a clear example of this, is that if you do falconry right, according to these modern falconers, the falcon is as wild as possible, and their preferred way of hunting is to let the falcon fly up into the air, and there what's called wait on, and then have dogs flush quarry out of, say, a pond or their hiding place, and then have the falcon stoop, as it's called, come down and knock the prey out of the sky. So it's very dangerous to let your falcon go up that high into the sky, because it's still a wild animal who might suddenly feel some wind and go, I have a migratory impulse, and now I'm gone. And so they also try now, they used to tie bells to their talons, now they use radio to track them. So it's not all that wild after all, right? But this is a very real possibility that the falcon will disappear, and then all your training, which can take months, has been for naught. But the falconer accepts this as part of the struggle for life, if you will. I don't know how much time do I have?
About a minute or two.
Okay, so I have quite a few passages that I could highlight, but let me just read a few here that give you an indication of what I'm talking about. So he writes, for example, one of the purposes of falconry is to keep the falcon performing very much like a wild falcon, only compromising those wild traits that could be harmful to the falcon in its new situation. He writes about other falconers, for example, Kent Carney, who is the curator of the Falconry Museum in Boise, Idaho. Kent was originally from California, had been educated at Berkeley and Princeton, and had traveled all over the world connected with military intelligence. Although Kent's main interest was falconry and the history of the sport, he was extremely well read, kept his radio tuned to the closest public radio station, and, if asked, could name almost any piece of classical music that was played. See, there's that sense of being educated and yet very much down to earth about it. He recounts visiting Ralph and Missy Rogers in Montana, where they sit down and watch a football game, and even though their team lost, nobody seemed upset. Because they're good people. The daughter, Andy, quote, was a happy girl and showed no signs of the false sophistication of many girls her age. Again, you can see the modesty, the honesty, and so forth. He rails against people in Denver who are transforming the landscape into something really fake. A woman who hates elk hunters, even though the elk basically are being killed by the suburban development that she's part of, and so forth. And he describes, for example, the typical case of Walt Disney biology. Suburban Denverites were mad at animal control people because they had killed a beaver they had trapped at the request of a suburban homeowner. And he writes at the end of that section, the death of animals displaced by human activity is the price of doing business. I can give you many more. Let me end here with the afterword he wrote for this book in 1996. He writes, when I wrote Rights, I knew few people who shared my passion for wild things without layering that passion with some romantic misinformation or silly New Age vision of how all things always work out for the best. Because in the book, I've come to know many people who also realize that a big part of the problem is the schism between popular environmentalism and genuine comprehension of the struggle for life that has been pervasive on this planet since day one. Everyone likes a happy ending, and in some ways, what has happened since this book was completed has given it a semblance of such an ending. But in a bigger way, Rights is still a sad story, and the chances of a truly happy ending remain remote, mostly because the destruction of habitat, the development of the American West, brings with it luxuries that are nearly impossible to resist. We want our wilderness and elbow room because we know that is the only real source of freedom. But we don't want to pay for its increased access to the baubles of the 21st century. We don't want to face the big question of capitalism into materialism or the cold dynamics of human overpopulation. The fact is we don't know what we want. Of course, ultimately, all our high-minded discussions about the environment versus the consumerism that destroys it will be moot. Earth will outlive us all. I guess it's that kind of resignation that he sees more in the culture of the Midwest and the Western Dakota area than anywhere else in the country. And I think that's ultimately what he means by his wild idea. Thank you.
Our final paper is from Michael Steiner, Professor Emeritus of California State University, Fullerton, and now recently relocated to the Midwest. He has written and edited many books and articles on the West and regionalism in America, including Medi West, Place, Culture, and Regional Identity, co-edited with David Rowell, and more recently, Regionalist on the Left, Radical Voices from the American West, published in 2013.
I need to get my things started, and I'm a klutz, a technological klutz. The person I'm going to talk about was an ultra-urbanite, probably never stepped foot into anything that was wild, so it's going to be a real contrast to the paper we just heard. And I want to just begin by, well, just saying I've been obsessed with this character, Horace Callan, got to learn to pronounce it correctly, Callan. Over the past 3 or more months, I moved to Cincinnati from Southern California, originally from Minnesota. You can probably still hear my voice. And I stumbled across the fact that his papers are in the Hebrew Union Archives, 99 boxes of papers. And so this has become just kind of an amazing process for me. So if it's a little obsessive in detail, please forgive me, and I'm going to try to gallop through this thing, but it's become really fascinating. And even more relevant and pressing is how timely this is. For Callan wrote with fierce indignation and defense of cultural diversity and free expression exactly 100 years ago. And we are going through in the face of ugly xenophobia and surges of rabid jingoism. 1917, the crucial year in the development of this theory. And history may not repeat, but it does rhyme. And we are certainly going through a period of time right now, a century later, that is very close in many ways to what both inspired and impressed Horace Callan and many other people. So I find this study really quite relevant. And I've got a lot to say here, so I just said one little adage: history doesn't repeat, but it does rhyme. And this is kind of destroying the punchline of my paper, but I'm going to give it to you anyway because I may not even get to it. And the very famous notion that Whitman said of Emerson. He said, I was boiling, I was simmering, Emerson brought me to a boil. And what I hope to say in this paper is, I'm going to translate it to Mr. Callan, and he was an Easterner who was simmering, and the Midwest brought him to a boil. And that's my basic point, is that if it hadn't been for those 7 years in the Midwest, we would not have had this very significant theory of cultural pluralism. And that's an episode that's been kind of ignored in the history of this idea and in stories about Mr. Callan's life. So I guess I gave you the punchline right at the beginning. But anyway, here we go. So let me get over here where I can. So you can see there he is, and he lived a long life, and I'm just going to start jumping into this. Harvard-educated philosopher Horace Callan spent 7 restless years in the Midwest. Living in Madison, Wisconsin from 1911 until 1918 while developing the theory of cultural pluralism, for which he is remembered, Callan had complex feelings about his new place and region. His response was far from exuberant, and scholarly discussions of this interlude are filled with images of a stranded Easterner itching to flee the provinces and counting the days that would end his exile. Callan's, although there is some truth to the story of a stranger to strange land, Callan's Wisconsin years were more complex and consequential than we've been led to believe. The primary purpose of this talk is to uncover the significant but surprisingly neglected Midwestern chapter of his life and the regional dimension of his influential theory. My talk also stresses the influence of geography in shaping ideas by revealing the silent but significant power of place, both in New England and the Midwest, in the life and thought of a restless and uprooted philosopher. Unlike Midwesterner Jane Addams, whose affection for our region and work in Chicago's ethnic maelstrom shaped her vision of pluralism, and she scooped him on pluralism. This is something very important to know. She came up with a theory of cultural pluralism several years before Horace Callan. That's another story. But unlike Jane Addams, Boston transplant Callan had mixed emotions about his new region while writing about cultural pluralism in Madison's calmer setting 150 miles away from Chicago. Addams, the daughter of an abolitionist politician and friend of Lincoln in rural Illinois, and Callan, the European-born son of an Orthodox rabbi in Boston, came from sharply contrasting backgrounds and developed their pluralistic theories in settings dramatically different from the places of their childhood and youth. Callan's introduction to the rural spaciousness of Wisconsin and Adams' immersion into the cultural pressure cooker of Chicago's Near West Side indelibly shaped their simultaneous visions of cultural pluralism. Rather than fully embracing the Midwest as Adams had done, Callan was restless and ambivalent about the land and people around him. His 7-year sojourn was an uneasy affair, filled with tangled feelings about the region. It was also a consequential encounter that broadened Callan's vision, adding a Midwestern imprint and geographical sensibility to his celebrated concept. A large body of scholarship examines Callan's famous theory, but surprisingly little mentions how Callan's Midwestern sojourn shaped his theory and brought it to maturity. Focusing on the transplanted philosopher as the sole creator of cultural pluralism and usually neglecting African-American philosopher Alain Locke's collaboration with Callan in creating this theory, and I'm going to get into that later. People ignore, most of them, that Alain Locke, well, we'll get into it, was a co-creator of this theory. Furthermore, these narratives also failed to mention him and other Midwestern-inspired pluralists at the time, among them Randolph Bourne, Ole Rollbach, I got it in there, Ida B. Wells Barnett, Reverend Ransom, and especially Adams, who also developed visions of cultural diversity in the emerging region. So there's a climate of opinion going on for developing cultural pluralism. Although Callan's Midwestern interlude was restless and filled with mixed emotions, his sense of the region was more embedded in his thought than his critics realized. The basic conviction of this paper is that geography has a silent or pervasive role in shaping ideas. Whether we know it or not, every moment of our lives takes place. I'm going to have to be quick on this one, but everything takes place. And a significant body of research reveals the power of place in shaping intellect. Places, both natural and humanly constructed, subtly affect the sensibilities of everyone, including, this is a quote from Paul Shepard, even intellectuals or eggheads who like to think we live in a world of ideas which we invent. Even transplanted and seemingly rootless philosophers, Callan among them, are strongly affected by the places they inhabit. In the process of excavating, let's see, next slide here. In the process of excavating the Midwestern sources of Callan's theory, uncovering a pluralistic climate of opinion there, and fully situating his thought, I'm going to go through 3 steps. I probably just get through 1 or 2 of them, but I'll try. First of all, I'm going to talk about his complex reaction to the Midwest. I'm going to kind of begin in the middle, then I'm going to go back to New England where he grew up, and then I'm going to return to the Midwest. It's kind of a weird approach, but I'm going to do it that way. Okay, so I'm going to skip this. This is a whole thing on place and intellect, and I will just unfortunately skip it. So here we go. Now, on August 14th, 1911, Harvard professor Barrett Wendell wrote a congratulatory letter to his former student who just landed a tenure-track job at a position at the University of Wisconsin. Quote, these are some of the letters I dug out of the archives here. I tried to cut it back. But anyway, the clouds have broken for you, Wendell gushed, praising the Midwestern University. Here you have a real chance to make yourself a future at what I've come to believe is the best of all Western universities, and this means to my heart of hearts, all of America. 2 months later, on October 10th, 1911, this transplanted philosophy instructor, after his first weeks of teaching Madison, wrote a discouraging account to his sister Miriam that week. I've fallen into a rut, and it all goes as if I had been at it for years, 29-year-old Horace Callan complained. I deliver my lectures, read my papers, and that is the end of the story. I have thus far no chance whatsoever to do any writing or anything else that's doubtful I ever shall. That is a big, fat lie. He did a lot while he was in Wisconsin. Let me move on. The situation seemed unchanged 10 days later when Alice James, widow of his mentor, William James, wrote to the young philosopher encouraging him to be more open to a new place. And it's wonderful what she wrote to him. Praising the university's president, Charles Van Hise, who would later defend the anti-war protests on campus, and emphasizing, quote, "After all, one must take people and places for what they are, not for what they are not." Callan's sense of displacement lasted through his 7 years in the Midwest. What might be dismissed as passing complaints of an upbeaten and overworked young professor persisted despite ongoing cheerleading from Eastern friends. And I'm going to skip some of this cheerleading. Let's just move on in the paper. But they were kept urging him on, and he kept complaining. Callan's Wisconsin years were surprisingly unsettled and constantly on the jump. His extensive correspondence reveals an uprooted Easterner in perpetual motion at the peak of his powers, engaging an ever wider vision of the country. Increasingly devoted to intertwined ideologies of Zionism and pluralism, he saw these two coming together. Callan trumpeted these related impulses with increasing zeal across the nation. Described as a Zionist circuit rider, pretty interesting phrase. Callan gained appreciation of the rest of the United States or world with his preaching Zionist and pluralist causes, first across the Midwest and then throughout the country. So he's anchored in Madison, he's moving across the Midwest. I don't know how he did it, teaching classes all over the place. The guy was a dynamo. When he wasn't in Madison teaching, he was on the road organizing, intercollegiate menorah societies, and ever-expanding forays across the land. In one of them, he converted Louis Brandeis to Zionism on a boat ride between Boston and New York in 1913. Big deal, big deal. So despite Callan's ceaseless missionary work and complaints about having no time for writing during his Midwestern years, they were among the most productive of his long and accomplished scholarly life, marking a peak of a career stretching over the first 7 decades of the 20th century. Between 1911 and 1918, he published 4 important books. I mean, here's a guy saying he has no time to finish anything. He wrote 4 books, at least 29 academic articles, many journalistic pieces, 2 plays, acted in plays, and a short story. Probably a lot more that I can't uncover. Although Callan would go on to publish at least 24 more books and hundreds of articles on a spectrum of subjects over the next 5 decades until his death in 1974, his Restless Wisconsin interlude marked a pinnacle of intellectual creativity and the realization of the concept of cultural pluralism, the Protean idea that is his most lasting achievement. Far from being wasted years lost wandering in the desert, Callan's Wisconsin interlude was in both positive and negative ways, was crucial in both positive and negative ways to its fully developed theory of cultural pluralism. In addition to forcing this uprooted Easterner to expand his spatial consciousness beyond the Hudson River, Callan's midlife immersion in the Midwest added a much-needed geographical dimension and depth to his theory. Here are some of his teachers at Harvard. I don't have time to go through and talk about all of them, but he had the greatest philosophical education imaginable, and he was a hard-scrabble, tough luck kid from the ghettos of Boston. But I'm going to just give you kind of so it allowed him to declare in his most fully conceived vision of cultural pluralism the quote, "Historical sectional differences between North and South, East and West have added diversity to diversity." He added a spatial and geographical dimension to his theory because of the Midwest. In the spaces of the continent, democracy could not but prevail, and the lives of cultural groups retain their integrity, even as the lives of individual spirits. Wisconsin itself, furthermore, offered far more inclusive political ideals and experiments than Callan had experienced back east. Despite his professed discomfort in Madison, he found much to admire there in terms of stimulating colleagues. I hope I get into this. I go into great detail later, but he found a lot of stimulating colleagues as well as depressing ones. Believe me, it was a very mixed deal there. And a more open society in the years before the onslaught and repression of war in 1917. In a revealing autobiographical passage written 16 years after he left Wisconsin, the philosopher warmly recounted the state's civic virtue, admitting that, quote, and I think I have this here, before the black interlude of 1917, things went all to hell that year and he left. But before that, He submitted, I stayed not easily, not quietly 7 years. For most of these years, I journeyed here and there in the state, lecturing, looking. I found something like a renovation of my young dream of the American way of life. It's quite an endorsement of the Midwest. He relished Wisconsin's quality of civic integrity, and it was during this period before the Black Interlude that thoughts which gave expression to culture and democracy in the United States came to their maturity. These are his words. Largely ignored by Callan scholars, this autobiographical passage and other primary and secondary sources revealed the Midwestern roots of his theory. So now I'm going to go back to New England, and I hope I don't run out of time here, but I just can't. His childhood, and how his thought was shaped by 2 stages of life in 2 regions. So Callan was born in Silesia in 1882, the first child of a Jewish Orthodox rabbi and his wife, and he came to Boston in 1887, so he's 5 years old. He had few memories of his first 5 years in Eastern Europe. His father, who had been expelled from Germany as an alien and a Jew, resettled his growing family in a working-class neighborhood in Boston's West End, where Rabbi Callan began serving a nearby Orthodox congregation. 7 more children were born. Horace was the oldest. There were 5 girls and then a boy at the end. Horace was expected to follow in his dad's footsteps, become a rabbi, in Orthodox, very serious Orthodox. One of most Callan's lasting memories was his fierce struggle with an authoritarian father who kept him away from public schools and the contamination of the Gentile world to study scripture at home. He ran away repeatedly, and it was the life-changing liberation when a truant officer sent 8-year-old Horace to nearby Elliott Grammar School against his father's will. I mean, they grabbed him and dragged him off to the public schools, and this was a big deal for Horace, you know. In an interview toward the end of his life, he said, "My father was a strict man. I didn't like him. My mother tended to stand between him and me, between him and the rest of us." And recalling the struggle of, quote, "my devout and learned and very snobbish father, too powerful, too demanding, to be idealized, to be anything but feared and dodged and hated," Callan looked back on his truancy as in some way, in most obscure, obstinate way, definable, conscious, the most personal part of my experience. So he grew up in a crowded household on the west side of Boston. It's kind of a primitive map, but you can see the West End, and these are some images of it about the time that Callan was growing up there. And so he lived a very impoverished life. He was not born with a silver spoon in his mouth, and yet he wound up going to Harvard as a scholarship boy. And I might have to skip through a lot of this, but what I do is I mention his kind of hard-knock ghetto childhood to Michael Gold's accounts of growing up on the Lower East Side in Jews Money and Alfred Kazin in his Walker in the City. And so Callan was found to be and encouraged and became a scholarship boy, rejected his father's orthodoxy, utterly rejected it. But what's curious, I'm going to have to gallop through this, so maybe I'll just show you some slides and talk, but he rejected his father's orthodoxy, went to Harvard as a scholarship boy, and ironically enough, and this is just some images of where he grew up on Boston's north side, and what I do is I use Richard Rodriguez's theory of the scholarship boy and how you come from an impoverished background and you go to high-falutin Ivy League schools like Harvard, and you reject your background and you become a blinkered pony, just blindly reciting the things that your sophisticated teachers tell you. But then Callan had a realization that he could return to his Jewish roots without taking on the theism. He adopted the Judaic history, Hebraism he called it, as a foundation of his thinking. And he had several teachers, so I compare him to Richard Rodriguez, and he had several teachers who influenced him at Harvard, many teachers. He was their chosen golden-haired boy, and one of the most influential was this Professor Barrett Wendell, who developed a theory of Hebraism and encouraged young Horace to be proud of being Jewish, as seeing the Jewish Hebraism as the foundation of American democracy. But more significantly was, oh boy, how am I going to do all of this? His teacher, William James, was also very crucial. But maybe I'll end this thing, because I see, when do we end? 3:30? Do we have till 3:30? Yeah, we do. Okay, Paul. So he's at Harvard. He's studying with George Santayana, Barrett Wendell, William James, Hugo Munsterberg, you know, the golden age of American philosophy. His teacher, Barrett Wendell, encouraged him to go into Hebraism, very interesting. Later on, we'll find out that he was kind of an SOB about racial ideas, but the most important influence was William James. And let me just say very quickly, William James's notion of philosophical pluralism, what happened is that Callan applied it to culture and society. James hinted toward that, and Callan studied with James. He happened to be at Oxford when James delivered his Pluralistic Universe series of lectures in 1908, I believe. And he happened to be there with the first black Rhodes Scholar in America, Alain Locke. And a few years before, 1908 or 9, Alain Locke had been a student in a class at Harvard that George Santayana and William James were teaching. You know, it's a quote, I don't know if they taught together, but these two guys, young Alain Locke, a 20-year-old, 21-year-old, and Horace Callan, a 24-year-old grad student, sat down and came up with the idea of cultural pluralism. They discussed it, and that was the origin of it. And so what this part of my paper talks about is that this was a white-black collaboration back about 1905, 1906. Callan recognized it, but Callan really got all the credit. Alain Locke went on to do all sorts of other very interesting things, as you all know, the Harlem Renaissance and so forth. But his contribution to the theory of cultural pluralism needs greater recognition. So there were certain episodes that happened. Let's see, I'm going to back up. I'm just going to let you look at these two people. As you all know, W.B. Du Bois went to Harvard just before Locke did, and he was also a student of William James's. Now, what happened was that when Callan was finishing his dissertation, he got a fellowship to go to Oxford, and he re-encountered his undergraduate student, Alain Locke, at Oxford as the first American black Rhodes Scholar, excuse me. And this was a shocking thing for the other American Fulbrighters. Many of them were from the South. They had a Thanksgiving party, a traditional party, and they banned this black, they called him a black boy, Negro with a small n, and so forth, from their event. And Horace Callan invited a few reluctant but willing other professors and people to have tea with Alain Locke. And this was kind of a noble stand, and he writes about this. It was really colored, though, by some pretty racist correspondence that I found that between Callan and his mentor back at Harvard, where they talk about Alain Locke in very condescending language. But Locke and Callan continued a lifelong relationship, and by the 1950s, Callan had expanded his theory of cultural pluralism to include African Americans. It took him a long time. It was a Eurocentric vision, and he credited Alain Locke with it. I can go into greater detail about this, but it was a very interesting episode in a black-white interaction in the early 20th century. So, let me just end with some slides here. So he winds up in Madison, 1911, kvetching about it. You know, I'm not Jewish, but it's going to use some Yiddish words on occasion. Spends a lot of time kvetching. But despite all of that kvetching, it was incredibly productive. He was inspired, and I think what I'm going to do is just end with a few images of his colleagues there and some of the events that inspired this great theory. Here's what Madison looked like about the time that Callan arrived in 1911. Here are some of the faculty and colleagues, and you know, it was a pretty star-studded group of academics there. You all know about E.A. Ross, who was a eugenicist, wrote a book. It wasn't called The Passing the Great Right. It was called The Old World in the New. There was a disgusting xenophobic tract, and Callan responded indignantly to it. John R. Commons, socialist, labor historian, someone that Callan knew there, who actually defended Callan later on. Richard T. Ely, a Christian socialist, who kind of became a cheerleader for the 100% Americanization enthusiasm, that's the wrong word, but surge of suppression. And then Charles Van Heist, the president, who defended Callan. But these are just some of the people who influenced him on the faculty. He had Jewish visitors, and he circulated among the Jewish intellectuals in the upper Midwest and the Midwest. Chuck Juliak, very important figure. Mary Hampton came, who he had known back in Austin. Boston, not Austin, oh boy. Edna Ferber, another Midwestern Jew who he knew kind of indirectly. These are the two books. What he did in his theory of cultural pluralism, published in 1915, the fullest version of it, was that he was reacting against the xenophobia and exclusionism of his colleague Ross on the one hand, but also to Israel Zangwill's melting pot on the other. Because Callan was appalled by the idea we all come and all be belted together and all be the same and lose our past. So his image of cultural pluralism went kind of treaded a very interesting line in between the two of those two perspectives. Here's Randolph Bourne, who visited him in 1917, and they exchanged ideas. And that encounter between Max Eastman was also there in Callan's apartment. And this was a very interesting moment in the development of this theory. Robert La Follette, who voted against the war, voted against the war, was castigated, pilloried. They wanted to basically tar and feather him, and Callan stuck up for him and felt that people should have the right to speak out. And there's a whole episode about how he was treated that I talk about. And his good friend Max Otto, philosopher, young philosopher, the lifelong friend, and Max Otto was attacked because he was born in Germany, and there's quite a campus flap over this. And Callan was very close to Max Otto, and I'm going to end with this. You see the young Horace Callan there looking very vigorous. See right here on the faculty. This may have been taken years later. There he is as an old man, and just one more quotation. The spacious continent has permitted the spontaneous self-ridding and automatic growth of differentiated communities for an effect. The United States in the process of becoming a federal state, not really a union of geographical and administrative entities, but also as a cooperation of cultural diversity, federation, commonwealth, and national cultures. So that's the regional geographical dimension of cultural pluralism. And I'll end with a very schmaltzy, maybe, but I think kind of profound. He published this. Variety is not only the spice of life, it is the light of life. He was a way out there pluralist. So I don't know, I'll just end there. Thank you.
I know you're itching to ask questions, but one thing the organizers indicated to us is that we can provide commentary, which was enough for me to get going. But I'll edit them on the fly. I have reflections about the Michaels papers. Tico is here to the various contingencies that worked out great, so we have it here, but I didn't have a chance to read the paper, which spares me the effort of trying to understand how NPR-loving Falconers fit into the issue of these regionalists. Actually, my research for these comments was to go back to Callan, who was a very fascinating figure, and I told Michael already how much I benefited and learned from his paper. And I guess the burden of my comments for for Michael and Michael are to think, okay, I get it, but. And so I thought it was worthwhile going to Culture and Democracy in the United States, which is a very difficult book to read. So it took me a little while to figure out some ideas, but it's important to remember that Callan was an ethnic particularist. He talked about the natio, or one's national consciousness, as being essential to who you are. That was a big part of him, and it's sort of an ethno-social conception of people, right? It's very important who your grandfathers were, and you cannot change that, and that means that's who you are, right? So in Culture and Democracy in the United States, he deploys the then ubiquitous symbology of pioneer and Puritan to analyze American culture, as did almost everybody else in the 19-teens and 20s. Holding that, quote, pioneer is not a simple primitive in a primitive land, but a, quote, civilized personality rendered primitive by the necessities of its environment. The result is what he called a, quote, duplex temperament. Not a hypocritical one, Callan was careful to note, but one marked by inevitable, quote, contradiction and strain. The root is the tension between the coercive matter of the natural scene and the, quote, imported behavior pattern of the community life with its memories, folkways, habits, and traditions that the natural conditions of pioneering continually check and transform, creating, he wrote, and I'm quoting him, an intense imaginative life in which the conditions and objects of the blocked and dislocated habits become in a fresh way insurance in fantasy against the insecurities of fact, which is a very telling line, right? Maybe applicable from everyone from Hamlin Garland to John Mellencamp. The imaginative life which creates an insurance in fantasy against the insecurities of fact. They become, he says, quote, symbols and images of a lapsed but remembered good. Sanctions for the endurance of present evil and assurances of escape from it. Unfortunately to Callan, this broad cultural inheritance became channeled into the narrow institution of the church. We should note that Callan highlights the Middle West, finding it a grafting of his native, New England, quote, an absorption and transmutation of the sweetness and light of that stern and rock-bound coast into the ways and substance of the campestral life of the Middle West. Campestral, growing, which means, I looked up, growing in uncultivated land or open fields is what campestral means. So, right, you take the rock-bound sweetness and light from the rock-bound New England, and you into the ways and substance of the campestral life of the Middle West. Alas, culture became too concentrated in the church, and while prosperous Middle West communities failed, quote, to flower in a more gracious and beautiful life, which is his statement, when culture and prosperity did clash, it created, Callan observed, writers like Frank Norris, Hamlin Garland, Booth Tarkington, Theodore Dreiser, Upton Sinclair, Edgar Masters, and he had a few others, who brought a, quote, bitterer vision, a less romantic judgment than that of the New England school. A bitterer vision, a less romantic judgment. There, that's the source, right? So culture confronts Philistinism. Culture confronts the Philistinism of these people, an old story. Michael Allen challenges that story a bit. He wants us to see the bifurcation of late 19th century and early 20th century authors, and late 20th century Midwestern rock stars, or at least one, even, as division not between frontier austerity and inherited folk traditions, but between cynicism and romanticism. He argues for a romantic yearning for rural worlds lost in the otherwise bleak or aggrieved or scathing narratives of Garland, Lewis, Anderson, or Mellencamp. There are two contexts here. The literary tradition that locates these early writers as part of the literary realist or naturalist camp, so not Mellencamp, but the others, who by challenging Victorian norms of gentility and by their unvarnished depiction of the hard, throttled nature of American culture previewed the full flower of modernism in America in the 1920s, so that's one context. And the other context that Michael brings forward is these writers as the populism's cultural wing, part and parcel of the angry and democratic uprising against the depredations of northeastern Canada. So Michael's interpretation is not incompatible with Callan's sense of the intense imaginative life of the pioneer taking solace in the, quote, symbols and images of a lapsed but remembered good. The question is what to make of these passing images of this Midwestern Arcadia. Was the idea to provide a moral admonition to the present, as Callan might be suggesting? Or is it sheer escapism, as Callan also might be implying? Or, as Callan actually wrote in reference to these writers, is there enough there to counter our inherited view of them as angry, even bitter, and unromantic prophets speaking against the constricting realities of austere, traditional, very intolerant cultures? Michael is suggestive, but does the entirety of their work support the case? And on the populist front, the person I would bring in to counter Hofstadter, who's writing in the 1950s, right, is Charles Postal. And Postal's book is the best book I've read recently on the populist. And in that, he presents the populist as, it's called the populist vision, as modern people. Right? It's a very revisionist account of populists, right? Commercially minded farmers determined to use science, railroads, education, and the newest managerial ideas to bring prosperity and success to their industry and to their region. Populist reformers in Postal's reading of an immense amount of populist literature were innovators, not seekers of rural words lost or imagined utopias. Quote, the populists understood that the transformations they sought required the uprooting of rural ignorance, inertia, and force of habit, he says on page 9. If the writers Michael discusses are romantic nostalgists, they were not populist in Charles Postal's view, right? So I think the question is, are these Midwestern figures arguably early examples of regionalism, the broad and capacious movement of the 1920s and 30s that in many ways was a kind of romantic counter to literary modernism, and holding up the agrarian past against the industrial present as a sort of more humane and communal alternative. It's sort of inversion of American modernism, or were they looking to modernism? And I think the jury's out of that, but it's a very suggestive idea, right? So put another way, do they define a modern identity based on ideas, such as tolerance, cosmopolitanism, scientific rationality, pluralism, free expression, which is a way to read people like Dreiser or some of these early naturalist writers, or were, as modernists, defining their identity by ideas, right? This is what a modern person should be. Should be open-minded against the sort of intolerant American. Or are they regionalists who think we should be defined by a tradition in place? So, Michael Steiner's paper gets at this idea. And the question is, to what extent was Callan's cultural pluralism a product of Boston or Madison, Wisconsin, or New York City, right? Or other places. I mean, it's a wonderful overview, and I'm excited to read more about Callan's life and his grumpy tenure in Madison, where he seems to have been both overworked and given to escaping by travel. And we get much about his intellectual maturation, too. Callan seems so focused on both race and culture. I mean, he's kind of a bridge between racialist ideas of identity that, you know, you can see Du Bois, something like that, and the Boasian revolution that fully took root in the 1920s and 30s, right, where culture replaces race. It's hard to think of him in conjunction with regionalism in place, so that's a really wild idea, right? Unlike Bourne, who wore his nationality lightly, or not at all, and Bourne scorned the orthodox nationalistic game, right? Callan felt, as I said earlier, who one's grandparents were was all important, your natio, right?
He would modify that, as you know, but yeah.
Yeah, he did seem to be moving to the idea of identity as a cultural product shaped by elective choices of affiliation. Okay. So where does Wisconsin fit into the picture? It doesn't quite emerge in this paper. What effect did the place have on him, given that he must have spent much time in the specific environments of emerging modern research university and a lot of time traveling? What made him so unhappy there? Was it the place or the workload of being an academic, which maybe he wasn't too happy with, and his life constantly on the jump? So I had a few more thoughts on that, but I think I'll stop there because I know you're eager to ask questions. But before I say that, just thank you very much to all three of these really fascinating papers. two questions.
I'll ask you a question of Tico. I think that I've hunted pheasants a few times with Dan O'Brien, so here's my theory on why he's in the Falcons. He's not a very good shot. Don't repeat that. But what about this whole idea of Yates and falconry and that? Is that something that ever comes up? And also I was thinking about T.J. Jackson Lear's work on getting boys back to nature and getting them out into the wild because industrialism was kind of ruining young children. Because you mentioned that National Geographic article. That seems to be part of that whole context.
Yes, you mean Yates, the Second Coming?
Yeah.
Yeah, that pops up in many writings by falconers. Indeed, didn't get into it here, but there's a whole world of symbolism of hawks and falcons flying away. Someone asked me earlier, how did you get into this? I think it may have been the Falcon, the Snowman, the movie in the 80s, when in the end, symbolically, the falcon is let go. So there's all that. Shakespeare is full of references to it as well, which O'Brien also recognizes. So there's certainly all that. In terms of the back to nature, what's interesting here is that falconers have come to blame gun hunting for the demise of falconry in Europe itself. That, as well as the carving up of open fields with fences and so forth, because typically falconry parties would include horses and dogs. This goes back to the Middle Ages when you have emperors writing books that are actually called Of Falcons, Dogs, and Horses, that whole sort of working together. So I think what happened is that, speaking of romanticism and nostalgia, when Americans discovered falconry in the late 19th and early 20th century, they saw in it sort of an old ancient practice they could bring to bear against modern industry, industrialization, and urbanization, and what have you, in relation to all these other, the national park movement, the state park movement, the Boy Scouts, first in England, then coming to America as well. Indeed, the sense that there's something out there that will indeed make men out of boys and so forth. In fact, as far as I can tell, with a few exceptions later on, this is mostly a male affair, the world of falconry. The problem is that while they think they are, in fact, sort of keeping alive an ancient practice, the word ancient comes up all the time in all these, everything they write, they actually reinvent it for American circumstances. So American birds, American environments, and it becomes more sort of a do-it-yourself sort of practice that they then basically begin to present as a conservationist effort. And these organizations and journals basically become sort of the gatekeepers of proper falconry. So as with sort of progressive conservationists, while they thought they were protecting wildlife and hunting, they protected only a specific kind of hunting and excluding other people from it, just catching these birds and doing whatever. So it's certainly related to that whole movement of hunting as a way to attain manhood, but also to stay in touch with nature. At the same time, very much shaped still by that notion that you could shape nature and have it do your bidding. So these early falconers that O'Brien writes about as sort of old fogies were indeed more pet keepers. And then these later guys like O'Brien himself were all about going to do this, keep them as wild as possible. So one example of this, and I'll say this for the last thing, is that the famous book, I don't know if anyone here read the recent book called H is for Hawk. Yep. So in H is for Hawk, the author, Helen MacDonald, writes about her dealing with T.H. White, goshawk, and how he used to walk around for days on end with this hawk on his wrist like this, getting it used to people and depriving it of sleep, because that's what the old book said you had to do to tame it. So that's a lot of human activity. Guys like O'Brien, and also now modern female falconers, actually just put their birds in the mews and leave them as wild as possible, just flying around. If they disappear, which is unfortunate. But I think it's best to just have them choose to stay around for the meat they feed them, whether or not they choose to leave. So there's certainly a move toward wildness, I guess, is what's going on here. So while he recognizes the interest of the old falconers. He's certainly moving away from that sort of more upper class pet keeping that again, the modern falconers find wrong. So there's much talk about how we do it in the literature.
More questions?
What, do you have any comments on the new problem in England, or old new problem of the fox hunting? It's a really raging thing right now.
Oh, yes. In fact, in the book somewhere it appears, because it turns out that some old Americans, like this guy named George Washington, you may have heard, was actually a member of a fox hunting club. So yes, in England there's been a lot of debate about the cruelty of the fox hunt. And that's the kind of ritualized hunt that falconry used to be. So these modern falconers would say that they're different, because they're basically letting their birds do what they would be doing anyway. Whereas the dogs would not necessarily be chewing apart or ripping apart foxes after having brought them to them with horses. So that they're saying, well, if you don't let them kill the duck, they will do it anyway. So you're basically just facilitating a natural process. Without convincing or not, that's another. And there were people back in the 20s who said it was cruel to treat the hawks this way, not the prey, but the hawks. So at the same time, people shot them all the time. So again, different choices.
All three papers are talking about essentially very successful people in the realm of ideas. We have an increasing thought in recent years and decades that the, quote, American dream has been a fiction, that you can't really rise from rags to riches, or you can't achieve success by, hard work and so forth. So how do some of the people that you talk about in your papers either support the notion that there has been opportunity in America, and what are the factors that go into it? I mean, is the American dream a true description of reality, or has it been completely, unfounded? And how?
Callan did go from rags to not exactly riches, but the fame, so it's kind of a Horatio Alger story. But he really latched onto his school teacher's stories about the heroic story of American history, and he held on to that. So on the one hand, he was kind of a radical pluralist, but he also constantly talks about great heroic figures in American history. I'm not sure I'm answering the question, John, but he did rise out of poverty, that's for sure. And he was the golden-haired boy at Harvard. Interesting story.
Upward mobility is not a myth. Forrest McDonald.
That's succinct.
We're at 3:35, so we have another question.
Yeah, a real quick question for Michael. Michael, what's your assessment of where agrarian thought and thinking stands? In other words, we have Lindelberry, we have Gene Logston, who's relatively recently passed away.